Hey, third graders. So today I'm going to do a little bit of a review on how mysteries tend to go. And then we will finish The Absent Author. This is the first time I've read that book. I keep telling you that. It's so bizarre to me. So mysteries, right? Usually there's some sort of a crime. And then the detectives have to look at different clues, right? And so some of those clues will help them figure out some of the suspects. Um, these suspects usually have motives, and one of the reasons I think this mystery is a little bit different is because we haven't had a ton of motives. I mean, we've had witnesses, and some of those witnesses seem to be potential suspects, but not a lot of motive, not a lot of why people may have committed the crime, right? And then there's a victim, and in this case, the victim seems to be Wallace Wallace, who's been missing. And then at the end, which is where we are, right? We're in this very last chapter of the book. We have some solution, right? So I've been keeping track of our summary and then also my suspects and my clues. And when we got last time, Miss Kelly read chapter 9, where they finally bust into the hotel room and they find a gentleman tied up in the chair, and they think it's Wallace Wallace, who says that two men dragged me in here and tied me up. And then when Dink asks, who kidnapped you? Who did this? Can you describe them? Ruth Rose, I'm just going to reread the very last part because this was crazy. So she says, "Hey," Ruth Rose suddenly yelled, and everyone looked at her. "And what's the matter?" asked Dink. "You look funny, Ruth Rose." Ruth Rose was staring at the red scarf draped around Mavis's neck. She pointed at the man who'd been tied up. "You're not Wallace Wallace." And then she looked at Mavis Green. "You are," she said quietly. So now we're starting chapter 10, which is the very last chapter of our book. And we're going to find out the solution. What was going on in this mystery? So for chapter 10, "Ruth Rose, what are you talking about?" Josh said. Dink didn't know what to think, except that he was getting a headache. "What makes you think I'm Wallace Wallace?" Mavis asked. Ruth Rose walked over to Mavis. "May I borrow your scarf?" she said. Ruth Rose held the scarf up so everyone could see it. "When I first saw this scarf, I thought these little black letters were M's," she said. "M for Mavis." She looked at Mavis Green. "But they're not M's, are they?" She turned the scarf completely upside down. "What do they look like now?" Dink stepped closer. "They're little W's now." "Right. W. W for Wallace Wallace." Ruth Rose pointed at the man. "You just said you live in a little cottage, but Wallace Wallace lives in a big castle in Maine. It says so on the cover of The Silent Swamp." Ruth Rose pointed at Mavis's book bag. "Seeing your bag again made me remember something I thought of today. Josh read that your castle was called Moose Manor. There's a picture of a moose on the side of your bag." Ruth Rose handed the scarf back to Mavis. "And we read that Wallace Wallace's favorite color is green. You like green ice cream. And you chose Mavis Green for your fake name." Everyone was staring at Ruth Rose, except for the man they had untied. He started laughing. "The cat's out of the bag now, sis," he said. Then Mavis laughed and gave Ruth Rose a hug. "Yes, Ruth Rose," Mavis said. "I really am Wallace Wallace." She put her hand on the man's shoulder. "And this is my brother, Walker Wallace. We've been planning my kidnapping for weeks." Dink stared at Mavis, or whoever she was. "Do you mean Wallace Wallace is a woman?" he said. "Yes, Dink, I'm a woman, and I'm definitely Wallace Wallace," and she winked at him. "Honest." Mavis, the real Wallace Wallace, sat on the bed. She took off her glasses and pulled the barrettes out of her hair. She shook her hair until it puffed out in a mass of wild curls. Okay, so we solved the mystery, right? We know that now Mavis Green was actually Wallace Wallace the whole time. We just didn't know. And so she and her brother cooked up this big, silly, fake kidnapping. We still don't know the motive, though. We still don't know why they did this. So we'll have to keep reading to figure out the real solution and find out everything. "Thank goodness I can be myself now," she said. "All day I've had to act like timid Mavis Green. I can't wait to get out of this fuddy-duddy dress and into my jeans again." She kicked off her shoes and wiggled her toes in the air. "Boy, does that feel good." Dink blinked and shook his head. Mavis Green was really Wallace Wallace? He couldn't believe it. But why did you pretend to be kidnapped, he asked. The real Wallace Wallace grinned at the kids' surprised faces. I owe you an explanation, she said. My new book is about a children's mystery writer who gets kidnapped. In my book, some children rescue the writer. I wanted to find out how real kids might solve the mystery, she explained. She smiled at Dink. Then your letter came inviting me to Green Lawn. That's what gave me the idea to fake my own kidnapping. I'd become Mavis Green and watch what happened. Oh yeah, Dink said. In your letter you said you were doing some research in Connecticut. She nodded. Yes, and I mentioned the word kidnap in the letter to get you thinking along those lines. She smiled at the three kids. I thought I'd have to give you more clues, but you solved the mystery all by yourselves. So that's why. The whole time she just wanted to be able to see whether her book was very realistic and do some research to find out how kids would do some investigative work if they really had a mystery to solve. Dink laughed. You recognized me in the bookstore for my picture, he said, and you didn't send me a picture so I wouldn't recognize you. Then my nutty sister dragged me into her plan, Walker Wallace said. I should have been home checking my lobster pots. While you were eating lunch, Walker and I ate ours up here, Wallace said. Then just before 2 o'clock, I tied him in the chair and ran downstairs to meet you out front as Mavis. Wallace threw back her head and laughed. Do you remember downstairs when Dink said there was something fishy on the 3rd floor? She got up and stood next to her brother. Well, I'm always teasing Walker about smelling fishy, from handling his lobster bait. So when you said something fishy was in the hotel, I had to pretend to cough so you wouldn't know I was really laughing. Boy, did you have us fooled, Dink said. Wallace grinned. Mr. Paskey was in on it. I had to tell him the truth. And as you saw this morning at the Book Nook, my little scheme made him very nervous. I've promised him I'll come back and do a real book signing soon. But I'll be in disguise, so be prepared for anything. Dink shook his head. I was so disappointed because I couldn't meet my favorite author this morning, he said. And I've been with you all day and didn't even know it. She looked at Dink. I'm so sorry I tricked you. Will you forgive me? Dink blushed. Sure. I have a question, Josh said. Where did you really sleep last night? Right here in room 302. A few weeks ago, I telephoned to reserve 2 rooms next to each other. Last night, I checked into room 303 as Wallace, the man. Up in room 303, I took off the hat and coat and sunglasses. Then I sneaked back down to the lobby wearing a blonde wig. I checked in again, this time into room 302. Did you smudge the signature? Ruth Rose asked. Oh, you noticed, Wallace said. I'm so used to signing my real name in books. I started to write Wallace, so I accidentally smudged it. I have a question, Miss Wallace. What should we call you? Dink asked. My friends call me Wallace, she said. Well, the taxi driver told us you were smiling in the taxi. What were you smiling about? Wallace was smiling now. Oh, about a lot of things. First, I was wearing a man's disguise, and that made me feel pretty silly. And I knew I was going to meet you, one of my biggest fans, and I was happy because I knew whatever happened, the next day would be fun. I sure had fun, Josh said, grinning. Poor Mr. Paskey, having to lie to everyone with a straight face. Boy, did I have a hard time pretending to be Mavis all day, Wallace said. But my plan worked. I met 3 brilliant detectives. You helped me to see how real kids would investigate a kidnapping. Now I can go back to Maine and finish my book. How come your book jackets never say that you're a woman? Ruth Rose asked. Wallace smiled. Because of my name. Most people assume that I'm a man, she explained. I let them think that so I can do my research easier. I've learned that people clam up if they know I'm Wallace. So out in public, I pretend I'm Mavis Green. Just a regular person, not a mystery writer. I get it, Dink said. You don't have your picture on your book so people can't recognize you. Right. And I hope you'll keep my secret. We will, right guys? Ruth Rose said. Thank you. Any more questions? Wallace asked. Yeah, Walker said, giving his sister a look. When do we leave? I've got lobsters waiting for me. I have a question too, Dink said. Will you send me your picture now? Yes, but I'll do better than that, Wallace said. I'll dedicate my next book to my 3 new friends. Dink, Josh, and Ruth Rose did a triple high five. Excuse me, Mr. Linkletter said from the door where he'd been standing. They all looked at him. It's nearly checkout time. Everyone laughed. Mr. Linkletter smiled. but just a little. So now we know. We found out the whole solution to this mystery, but I do want you, and a lot of the times mysteries do wait until the very end of the book for you to find out the true solution. But one thing that I do, like I said, I talked about how this book is a little bit different. A lot of the time in mysteries, you have suspects, clues. Maybe it's this suspect and maybe it's this motive. But this book really, it didn't give you many motives until the very end. So that's something you want to pay attention to, is that some books will give you some suspects and some potential clues with some motives so that you have to pay attention to more than one suspect and a little bit more. And in this book, there were a ton of suspects, but it was really because it was a lot of people who had potential contact with Wallace Wallace. But in the end, it just ended up that it was kind of a silly one. The real ending and the real solution was really that Wallace Wallace was never for real kidnapped, which is kind of goofy. So hope you guys liked that book. That was the first one in A to Z Mysteries. So if you are interested in reading more of these, you don't really have to read them in order, but this was letter A. And if you want to check out any of the other letters, you don't have to read them in order. So that's what I want you guys to do. The next coming up, we are going to start a brand new read aloud that goes with our more of our mystery lessons. And I know that a lot of you are finishing up your book club books and you'll be moving into doing some other ones on Epic. So we'll talk about some of the other things to keep in mind as you're reading mysteries when we start our next lessons and our next book. I'll talk to you soon. Love you. Bye.